Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the Alumni Relations Office, I want to welcome our alumni, parents, student, faculty, staff, and community members to this afternoon's conversation with Susan Thornton. My name is Sarah Chingos, and I'm the Associate Director for Public Service in the McKean Center. It is my great pleasure to introduce this afternoon's speaker, Susan Thornton. Susan is a former Acting Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs and a graduate from the Bowdoin class of 1985. Her daughter, Catherine, is a member of the Bowdoin class of 2022, and we hope that she's able to join us today. Thornton's 28-year diplomatic career focused primarily on East and Central Asia and included posts in Chengdu and Beijing, China, and Ashgabat, Turkmenistan. In 2007, she was named Deputy Director of Chinese and Mongolian Affairs, and in 2014 was named First Deputy and then Acting Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. After leaving the State Department in 2018, Thornton joined Yale Law School as a senior fellow and research scholar at the Paul Tsai China Center. She also serves as the director for the Forum on Asia-Pacific Security at the National Committee on American Foreign Policy and is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution's John L. Thornton China Center. She serves on the boards of the Eurasia Foundation and the National Committee on U.S. China Relations and is a member of both the Camden Conference and the Council on Foreign Relations. In addition to her economics and Russian majors at Bowdoin, Thornton holds degrees from the National Defense University's Eisenhower School and Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. She speaks fluent Mandarin Chinese and Russian. But before I introduce her talk today, let me cover a quick housekeeping notes. Audience members are encouraged to submit questions through the Q&A function throughout the discussion. I will be monitoring it and feeding Ms. Thornton questions posed from the audience following her initial comments. Closed captioning is also available for this, and the conversation is being recorded and will be made available in the following days on the Bowdoin website. Thornton's talk today is titled A Better U.S. Approach to China and is part of programming for Asian Heritage Month and in connection with the Reunion Talk series. China's rise has recently been described by U.S. government officials as a whole of society threat and the greatest challenge the U.S. faces. Susan has worked on U.S. policy toward China for much of the last 20 years and will give us her perspective on how we got to where we are today, what we are missing or misunderstanding about China, and how we can use diplomacy to move forward in a way that's beneficial for all. Please join me in warmly welcoming Susan back to virtual Bowdoin.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and it's so great to be back with all of my Bowdoin people, and wish I could be with all of you in person. We missed our reunion last year, but hopefully we will be able to get together in person in the not too distant future. Thanks so much for joining me today for this talk about the U.S.-China relationship. I think most people would agree that the U.S.-China relationship is going to be the most important bilateral country relationship in shaping the future world that we all live in. We have, the two countries with the largest economies in the world. We also are the two countries with the largest militaries in the world. And the US and China are also countries with global ambitions that have global interests and involvement in almost every issue that comes up in international discourse and international relations. And of course, they're countries with different histories and cultures and political and social systems and different ways of doing things, which gives rise to an extremely complicated and at times pretty fraught set of interactions between the two. I think, to understand what's happening in US-China relations today, though, we really need to look back at the course of recent events, especially the period since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1981. That, of course, marked the end of the Cold War and really the onset of the so-called unipolar world order, where the US was in this position of unrivaled dominance in the world in a way that it really hadn't been since the end of World War II. And, this was the time, 1991 or so, when all of my Bowdoin classmates and I were starting out on our careers. It seems like eons ago now. And that's when I joined the Foreign Service, actually, was the very year that the Soviet Union disappeared. And my major in graduate school also disappeared with it. And I joined the Foreign Service and became a US diplomat in that year. I remember at that time, there was a very prominent line of thinking encapsulated by an article written by Francis Fukuyama, a big international relations scholar, called The End of History. And he wrote a book actually called The End of History and the Last Man. And this was really promoted the notion that sort of all countries in the world were going to converge as liberal market democracies, and that, after the Soviet collapse, it proved that there was only really one right way to do things, and that we would all come to see the light and live happily ever after. But of course, China had other ideas, and this had become pretty apparent and should have been apparent following the Tiananmen student protests and the subsequent crackdown, that they were not going along with democratic convergence. And that all happened in 1989. Chinese leaders, though, they had a very clear idea of what they were trying to do, which had everything to do with restoring China's strength and its power and its place in the world. The priority for them was on economic development, and China's leaders firmly and, of course, self-servingly judged that only the Chinese Communist Party was going to be in a position to deliver on that. So, while the US worked on various preoccupations like dealing with the post-Soviet collapse legacy in the Balkans, where we were trying to work on Bosnia and the conflict there in the 90s. Then we worked on, of course, the Great War on Terror following 9/11 in 2001. The US and China found a modus vivendi during this period where China basically agreed. The unspoken agreement at this time and over the last period of history has been that, China would not challenge US leadership of the international system. And it basically accepted that system. Whereas the US would not fundamentally challenge China's different political system or try to block or stymie China's economic development. And of course, quite the opposite. I mean, the US really assisted China's development, and the resulting economic cooperation between China and the US, but also China and the rest of the world, really boosted economic growth and globalization inside that US-led international system. But I think, we have to recognize that as China grew during that period, the ground under this US-led unipolar world order was shifting. And, I lived through all of this, and, we still haven't had a lot of time to look back in the rearview mirror on these events. And a lot of people are commenting on them now with respect to US domestic developments. But I would say that this shifting world order really came to a head in the 2008 global financial crisis, with respect to US-China relations, as well as other things, obviously. Up to that point, China and the US were really in a kind of a student-teacher relationship in many respects regarding China's economic development and modernization. China had, was buying, of course, sometimes stealing and not paying for, but most of the time buying US technology. US companies were setting up manufacturing operations in China, and China was very deeply engaged in discussions of macroeconomic coordination and global financial issues with US government officials. But after the great financial crisis, China really began to question, I think, US dominance of the global system, particularly the economic system. And other countries at the time were also kind of joining this chorus, but China was definitely leading the chorus at the time. And, the US did respond to this sentiment out there among other countries. And in the wake of the crisis, it created the G20, so-called, which was this grouping of 20 kind of major countries, major economies, that was put together to bring more players into this sort of urgent economic arrangements to address the crisis, but also to sort of diversify the participation in global economic arrangements and give some of the emerging economies a bigger say in some of the arrangements in managing global interconnectedness and globalization. And China was a major player at that time that helped to sort of stem the tide of the crisis. They injected a huge amount of stimulus into the global economy, and China was less affected by the global financial crisis than other economies were, and they had a lot of foreign exchange reserves on hand and other capacity on hand to inject into the system. And so, that whole episode, 2008, 2009, recovery from the global financial crisis, that really ushered in a period of, I think, increasing Chinese insistence that global arrangements needed to somehow be altered and move away from this kind of US dominated picture that we had seen up to that point, and that other powers should have more say in international institutions. And they were really focused on the international economic institutions, it has to be said. At the same time that all of this was going on, of course, a lot of problems in the US China relationship had been continuing, ongoing, and in some cases were really festering. And not being addressed as the US was sort of preoccupied in Iraq and Afghanistan, et cetera. In particular, some of these issues were issues related to the security arrangements in the Asia Pacific, of course, protection of technology and intellectual property of US companies from Chinese either theft or appropriation or transfer, et cetera. And then there were many issues related to distortions in the global trading system as a result of China's entry into the WTO in 2001. So, it's huge economy, different kind of system. We try to absorb it into the international trading system, and there were a lot of problems that came with that, not all of which were addressed as diligently as they should have been. And again, the preoccupations with the war on terror provide some of the explanation as to why that didn't happen. And some of these problems were definitely made worse by the consequences of all the stimulus from the trying to remedy the great financial crisis. So China, for example, launched huge construction projects as part of their stimulus, with huge production of steel and cement and a lot of other things that then kind of got dumped on the international economy and created a lot of dislocations. So, and of course, there were human rights problems continuing all through this time, and a lot of US complaints about China's treatment of its own citizens were just a feature of the relationship ongoing. And there were, some periods where things got a little better and some period where things got a little worse, but this was a continuing theme of discord between the United States and China, as it still is today, of course. And then, if you think about back to that time, 2008, 2009, this was the same time China's confidence in the US was diminishing. Its own ambitions were kind of growing after the great financial crisis and after the successful Beijing Olympics in 2008. And this is the same time when Xi Jinping became the anointed next leader of China. He was elevated to that position in 2008. So the coincidence of timing is interesting if we look back on that from our current vantage point. But I think a lot of people sort of forget about why Xi Jinping became the guy that was anointed sort of to take over from Hu Jintao as China's main leader. And, we have to remember that in 2008, 9, 10, China was facing some pretty extreme internal challenges and societal cleavages. And that was really, I think, more the driver behind the change in leadership in China than anything else. And Xi Jinping, when he took over in 2012, he was put in charge to resolve these issues, and so immediately set about doing so. And it included a lot of things that were China domestic issues that we didn't have a lot of things to say about, like anti-corruption measures and going after threats to the unity of the Communist Party in China, taking down some of the major opponents that had been in the party up to that point, who were obviously, seeking to undermine Xi Jinping's leadership or the choice of him as the leader. They also undertook a huge reform of the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese military at that time, which was a major task that Xi Jinping had obviously been partly, put forward in order to tackle. But of course, Xi Jinping, as part of all of this, also cracked down on dissent, which further introduced discord into the U.S. China relationship, starting in the 2012, 13, 14, that period of time. And we've seen that kind of crackdown on dissent continuing, not just in sort of on dissidents in China, but of course in minority areas, and most particularly in Xinjiang with regard to the Uyghur minority population there. Now, there were other mounting problems in U.S. China relations during this time, but I think they all, should be seen now in retrospect against the backdrop of this changing international power structure. I mean, the U.S., again, involved in Afghanistan and Iraq at this time, so that was a major preoccupation with the war on terror. There was financial crisis in Europe following the global financial crisis, came several years later. Mopping that up was a big preoccupation of most of the major powers in the world. There was Russian aggression against Crimea, resurgent nationalism kind of all around, et cetera. So there's been a lot going on in the background to the US China relationship and to this kind of shifting power structure in the world. China was frustrated with the lack of movement in international institutions and continued, I think, US dominance of the system, but it didn't really directly challenge the US in this period. Instead, what we saw was that China started to create these new institutions that didn't include the United States. So they set up together with Russia the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which was aimed at sort of shoring up security and stability in Central Asia. They started the BRICS, Emerging Developing Countries kind of organization, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, to try to show that these countries also matter and they can have a forum and they can contribute to international issues. And they also, importantly, I think, set up the AIIB, which is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And they launched, Xi Jinping in 2013, launched the so-called Belt and Road Initiative, which is his signature initiative to build infrastructure, Chinese financed infrastructure in developing countries. And I think it was the reaction in the US to the Asian Infrastructure Bank and the Belt and Road Initiative that where China really began to understand, I think, that the US was not as accepting of China's rise as it was claiming up to that point, and that China might face real resistance and confrontation with the US in the future. So that was kind of, we had the US attempt to try to get countries to not join the Asian Infrastructure Bank that China started. And the US lost badly in that gambit, and all of its allies ended up joining. And the US and Japan have still not joined, the only two countries, really significant countries, that haven't joined. And then, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative has now become this very divisive project, although, on the face of it, as far as the recipient countries are concerned, this is an option for them to finance infrastructure that they think they badly need. So, so that has been a lot of the story, at the end of the Obama administration. Then we have, entered the Trump administration. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, because I think it's pretty easy for everyone to see how Trump's approach to China kind of would have cemented China's assessment that the US was not viewing China's rise as being legitimate, and that China saw that the US was viewing China's development as a real threat. And I think Trump's kind of unpredictability and his tendency toward sort of making every issue into a domestic political grandstanding moment made China think that during the Trump administration, at least, there wasn't much they were going to be able to do to change the trajectory of the situation. It was clearly deteriorating. I think they were quite shocked by the launch of the trade war in 2018. They thought they had, started negotiating with their counterparts in the U.S. They thought that, they were going to have a normal trade negotiation. There was going to be some agreement that would work. And, that did not work. And then things just kept deteriorating from there. And I think, they felt, especially in January of 2020, when they finally got this trade agreement signed, and then pretty much the next week, the COVID-19 pandemic hit, and things really went out of control in US China relations from there. I think that had sort of cemented their sense that there was, no matter what they would do, things with the US would not be good. And I think that point is crucial, because China might believe that, and I think they do believe, that US strategy is really to try to undermine China's political system. They have a lot of suspicions about what we're up to with respect to trying to, change their government. And this was, of course, reinforced by a lot of comments made during the Trump administration. But nevertheless, they're quite pragmatic. And what they really want is to have kind of stable relations with the US, because, again, the priority for the Chinese leadership hasn't changed, since 1979. It's all about economic development. And so they have historically been willing to make concessions, for the sake of keeping a stable relationship with the US. And I think under the Trump administration, again, they thought no matter what concession they make, things won't improve. So this is the legacy that we've carried forward now to the Biden administration. I think it's very easy to see how difficult things are at the moment. The US wants to project an image of being back as the sort of leaders of the international system. We're going to reassume global leadership just as we had it before. Domestic opinion and media and politics in the United States have all kind of oriented toward this pretty hostile portrait narrative about China and US China relations. Recent polling actually shows unfavorable ratings of China in the US starkly changing in recent years. We moved from a pretty consistent, used to be in the US public 50% more or less were consistently kind of unfavorable on China, whereas the other half was kind of favorable, or at least neutral. And now, in the last few years, that has shifted where 90% of the US public has an unfavorable view of China, according to recent polling. And that number has even increased under Joe Biden's leadership over the last 3 months. So that shows you how little space really in the US political system there is for any kind of cooperation with China. And given the contentiousness of the relationship, I think there's also very little space in China for cooperation with the US at the moment. In fact, I mean, it's US organizations that are urging this move to boycott the Beijing Winter Olympics in 2022. And the US government is the only government that has declared the atrocities that are ongoing in Xinjiang with respect to the Uyghur minority there. We're the only government that's declared that to be a genocide. No other government has followed our lead on that. So that sets up a pretty acrimonious dynamic. And just to give you an idea of the historical context for that, the last Olympic boycott that the US led was 1980 Moscow Olympics. And that time, we had just recognized the People's Republic of China in 1979. The Soviet Union had just invaded Afghanistan. And Jimmy Carter's government led the boycott of the Moscow Olympics in 1980 to protest. Many of our close allies in Europe did not fall in with us in that boycott, but China, who was going to have a team at their first ever Summer Olympics, did join the US in 1979 and boycott the Moscow Olympics. And that was sort of the beginning of the heyday of US-China cooperation against the Soviet Union, and ending with the Chinese running guns to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, et cetera, et cetera. So it shows you how far we've come in Olympic diplomacy with China, that we're now leading the boycott movement against the Chinese Olympics coming up next year. So I guess in my last few minutes here, I'll just talk briefly about, what do I see as the way forward in both the short term and the longer term. It's a very difficult atmosphere, obviously, but I think, some people have seen that this structural change in the global system that I've been mentioning, with, this unipolar system that the US dominates, sort of giving way to something more multipolar. Many people believe that that's going to result in a kind of inevitable conflict between the US and China. And I personally, people have talked about this Thucydides trap, where in history it's kind of recorded that in cases where there's a rising power and a status quo power, the fear on the part of the status quo power about a challenger coming up leads inevitably to war. I think in the 21st century, we have gone beyond that now. I think our diplomacy can do better than that, but it just goes to show you how dangerous, the current moment could be. And certainly a clash between the US and China is something that we need to avoid, because it really could be devastating, not just for the US and China, but for the entire, of course, global economy, never mind other states in the region. So I think the first thing is that we need to recognize that no matter how convenient or handy it is to go back to this kind of Cold War frame that some of us grew up with, and some of us on this call are probably too young to remember, I hope, but nevertheless you hear it referenced constantly in official discussions. And thinking about things all the time in terms of state-on-state competition or state-on-state conflict. I think most of our future major challenges as a country and a species are likely to come from, not from traditional state-on-state conflict. And we have to look no further than this recent COVID-19 pandemic to see how actual that is. I was looking recently, the US intelligence agencies issue every 4 years a report on global trends where they talk about what are the upcoming things that we should be focused on and concerned about. And, none of the top, global trends that they see are having to do with state-on-state conflict. They're all about societal conflicts, political upheaval, disorder from lack of government authority, pandemics, environmental challenges and national disasters, weapons of mass destruction getting into the wrong hands, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, we need to put US-China tensions in perspective. And most of our historical analogies are not going to be sufficient to take account of the work that's been done in the international system since the end of World War II, and it doesn't take account of the sort of patterns of globalization that have evolved, whether we are comfortable with them or not. They are not going to be stopped, and they're not going to be put back in the bottle. It's going to continue. So I think we need to sort of take a calmer attitude toward this and not see everything in terms of black and white, black hat, white hat, good guy, bad guy. We will have occasion, of course, to work with China in multilateral efforts in the near future. So we're working with them already right now in a plurilateral context on restoring this Iran nuclear deal that was concluded under the Obama administration. I don't know whether that will be successful or not, but China has a major role to play and is playing. Also, of course, on climate change, we'll be working with China in multilateral formats. And we saw President Xi, attended and made comments at President Biden's recent climate change summit on Earth Day. So I think we should focus on bilaterally on efforts to avoid conflict and avoid military accidents and incidents. We've had military accidents and incidents with China in the recent past, and we were able to control those and manage them, but we had much better communication and much better relationship with China when those things happened in the recent past. And I think we need to focus on making sure that we're not going to have a crisis that gets out of control, because I think that could be devastating. So we need to develop crisis management kinds of mechanisms, and we need to talk more. Diplomacy is something we very much got away from in the Trump administration. We need to double down on communication and clear signaling between the US and China on sensitive issues like Taiwan, like maritime disputes in the South China Sea and the East China Sea between China and our close US allies. These are areas where we could get into some trouble, and we need to make sure that we understand each other clearly before anything goes wrong. And I think these discussions will also allow us to restart normal diplomacy with China and talk about specific issues where we can clarify our understandings. And my hope is that, over time, we can work more closely with China on a positive agenda, because I think there are just endless numbers of areas where we're going to both be involved, both be working, and it would just be so much easier if we can be working in the same direction collaboratively. But I think there are a lot of items on the domestic agenda in the US and also domestically in China that are going to make this difficult in the near future. But we shouldn't count it out. And because of this, and this is my final point, keeping up non-governmental connections with China is going to be essential. Chinese and US medical researchers managed to work around government-to-government animosity to share best practices directly with each other when they were confronted with an inundation of COVID-19 cases. And some of our most talented students, of course, are from China. And a lot of our cutting edge innovation is the result of collaborations with researchers from China, which we're not going to find anywhere else. So certainly, also our major businesses are deeply invested in China. They are committed for the long term to the China market, to selling to Chinese people in that market. And of course, Chinese companies are also invested in the US market. And I think we can't lose sight of the fact that China is the biggest contributor to global growth. It's likely to be the case going forward in the future, and that its economy is central to the fates of the fastest growing economies in Asia and in the developing world. So I think our relationship with China can evolve into one of closer partnership over time, but I guess I have to say that we will have to be patient, because the near term is probably going to be a little bit more tense. And in the end, we basically need to really focus on more communication and more understanding and realistic assessment of the adjustment that's going to be needed on both sides. I think a lot of the narratives that each of us are telling ourselves about the other right now are not based on very good, very realistic assessments. So I'll just stop there. Sarah, thank you so much for listening to my talk. And I love to hear what people think. Any comments or questions, I welcome them.
Great, Susan. Thank you so much for those introductory comments. You covered a number of topics, and there are a lot of questions that are rolling in already. And I want to encourage audience members to please continue to submit your questions through the Q&A function, and I'll get to as many of them as we have time to before our time is up this afternoon. So one thing I wanted to talk about, there are a number of questions that have come in regarding the risks associated with Taiwan. You touched on that very briefly, and I'm wondering if you could go back. Questions asked include, please discuss the risks associated with Taiwan. What would trigger an invasion by China, and will the US defend Taiwan? Will China become more aggressive, and how should we respond?
Yeah, this is an issue that's been a major preoccupation of mine as I've worked on China over the years. It continues to be a major preoccupation for people working on China and cross-strait issues and Taiwan issues today. I think we should maintain a healthy level of attention and concern about what's happening in the US, China, Taiwan kind of triangular relationship, but we should not be overly alarmist. And I've seen a lot of the recent kind of media attention here on this issue as being a bit in that category. So, a lot of people have speculated that one of the reasons that, Xi Jinping keeps talking about national rejuvenation, and one of the reasons maybe for his aspirations to stay on longer than the typical 10-year term for a Chinese president, is because he's in a bit of a hurry to bring Taiwan back into the fold, so to speak. And in case people don't know, the issue of China and Taiwan is one that's sort of left over from the Chinese Civil War in the 1940s. When the Chinese communists took over in 1949, the nationalist government basically fled to the island of Taiwan, set up their own government there. And that was the government that the US recognized for many years until we switched recognition to the PRC in 1979. So the US has a particular relationship with Taiwan that's a legacy of history. And, the idea has been that China will commit to peaceful reunification. So the US does not accept that there would ever be, a resort to confrontation in order to reunify Taiwan with the mainland. And the part of the bargain the US had signed up to is that we would have a one China policy. We wouldn't recognize two Chinas. We wouldn't support Taiwan independence or a separate state, so that the prospect of reunification could stay open-ended until it was resolved peacefully. And that's the bargain that was, struck in 1979. It's a very delicate, fragile kind of arrangement. And, all the parties to the arrangement are constantly trying to move the status quo in their favor. So it makes it very difficult. And it has to be managed very carefully. But I think that the Chinese are not in a major hurry. Again, their main priority is on economic development, and nothing would sabotage what they've done over the last couple of decades more than trying to take back Taiwan by force. And I think they know that. So I think we should pay attention, because it's very fraught issue, and we should worry about it, but we shouldn't be alarmed.
Great, thank you. I'm going to read a question that came in from Andrew Davis. And I think some of these are classmates. I'm not sure. Some of them have identified as classmates of yours. And if you have not, but from Andrew Davis, he writes, the UK Parliament about a week ago actually echoed US position on China's treatment of Uyghurs as genocide. If other large powers like the UK and US continue to echo that declaration, what effect do you think it will have on China's international public image and domestic response to the issue? And as a follow-up, do you think it is wise of the larger international community to make such similar declarations?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I haven't looked through all the questions, but I do see some of my classmates on there checking in and saying hi. And I really appreciate them tuning in. And I really hope I can see them at the next reunion whenever we can have that in person. But on this question of the Uyghur treatment of the Uyghurs, I mean, of course, this is like a devastating thing to have to reconcile, especially on the part of a major power that's a permanent member of the UN Security Council and holds a veto. I mean, it's just not acceptable for major powers to be treating their citizens like this, to be disappearing people into incarceration where you don't know what happened to them, this kind of thing, and all of the other atrocities that have been associated. I will point out, though, and I think it's important because it's an important distinction in diplomacy. The British and the Canadian parliaments have both passed, I think, non-binding resolutions about genocide with respect to the Uyghurs. That's not the same thing in diplomacy as the executive branch of a government making that kind of a declaration. So far, it's really only the US that has done that. And I will also say that there have been a lot of discussions about what to do about the Beijing 2022 Olympics, and there is no desire or no enthusiasm that I can detect in any other country for pursuing a boycott. I don't even think there's really that much enthusiasm in the US because of course, we don't want to punish the athletes who've been preparing for this. So people are thinking about other things to do. But I really don't believe that there is much leverage that we have to change Chinese policy in this area. I do think international pressure helps to get China to understand that this is, unacceptable, and that, this is, something that the international community is not ever going to accept. But on the other hand, the Chinese view of this is that this is a de-radicalization program, and it's worked because we had bombings in Xinjiang, we had a terrorist threat, and we haven't now had any of that kind of activity for the last several years since we started this program. So it's a real kind of divergence of views, and I don't think that ratcheting up pressure and sanctions is going to actually change the Chinese policy. In fact, it's probably going to make them less amenable to changing, at least publicly, what they're doing, because it'll make them more dug in. It's important, though, to show our adamant kind of unacceptance of this. And so I think in that sense, statements, sanctions, and other things can be helpful for sort of reaffirming our commitment to these bedrock principles. But it's a very, very, very hard issue, and I think it's gonna sort of be continuing for the foreseeable future in terms of China's treatment of its own citizens. It's not just, I mean, the Uyghur situation is front and center now, but if you remember back in the 2008 Olympics, it was the treatment of the Tibetan minority in China that was getting all the attention, and there were demonstrations and self-immolations and all kinds of other things happening. So I think this is a pattern, and we hope that it will be eradicated at some point, and we'll just have to keep working on it. I do think we could be doing more productive diplomacy in this area with China, and certainly the sanctions and statements and umbrage haven't worked. So I think we should probably be trying something else as well. But I'm not saying that I think it's going to be that effective.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a follow-up one question. I know there's been a lot of conversation recently about it and in President Biden's comments last night, but could you speak a little bit about how the U.S.-China relationship is affecting global progress on climate change?
Sure. Climate change was an area of intense U.S.-China cooperation under the Obama administration. For 8 years under the Obama administration, we worked very hard to develop actual kind of cooperation projects in areas like carbon capture sequestration with Chinese, scientists and engineers. We worked on eco partnerships where we would get civil society organizations in China and the US together to work on particular project areas. We worked on clean energy projects, and there's some cutting edge stuff that was happening in China that US companies were helping with under the sponsorship of the Department of Energy, et cetera, et cetera. All that ended in November 2016, and it has not been restarted. So there's a loss there that is probably going to be very hard to recover. Right now, I think the best way for the US and China to cooperate on climate change is sort of the pattern that we've seen with the Biden administration up to this point, which is, in a multilateral context, you can bring China in and work with other partners of the US to try to move China in directions that are needed for more climate CO2 emissions mitigation. So I think for now, it's going to be mostly a multilateral story. China is, of course, wants to be seen as a leader in climate change. It wants to be seen as doing its part. That doesn't mean that it's going to take responsibility for having gotten the planet to this point. They very clearly want to make sure that the onus and the responsibility, the major responsibility for, the accumulation of emissions up to this point is laid squarely at the feet of the developed countries. And they don't want to lose out on economic development that they feel that they are, entitled to and haven't had yet. But they are trying to join kind of the US and Europe and other countries in this race to develop technologies which they hope can actually then help to sort of make up for whatever losses in economic development they will get from making this transition to cleaner kind of industry and cleaner transport and all of the other things that are needed for the transformation to lower emissions. And a 2060 carbon neutral goal for China is actually, I think most people who do climate, and I'm not one of them, but many people who do climate think that's a pretty ambitious goal for China to try to meet. What they're worried about is whether or not China will meet it and what steps, will we be able to see the steps that are going to be credible to meeting that goal? And I think that's where the work is going to be done.
Great, thank you. There's a question that came in from Alex Barker that says, I'm curious about the cyber agreement you were instrumental in implementing under Obama. What is your position on this 6 years on? Should Biden and Blinken be seeking another cyber détente with China now? And if so, how might they go about that? Yeah,
that's a great question. I think the issue of cyber activity in the international space has gotten so complicated that it's very hard to see the way forward now. In the Obama administration, the agreement that we negotiated with China was to acknowledge a principle, a new principle, with respect to kind of economic espionage. And that was to say that, we all know that states spy on each other and try to get secrets. But what we cannot do is have the state use its kind of preponderance of agencies and mechanisms to spy on another country and then take that country's economic secrets and give it to private sector companies so that they can dominate the market and beat out their other private sector rivals from other countries. So that was the principle. It might sound like not very much, but up to that point, before we had that agreement, China, and not just China, but China among other countries, had not acknowledged that this was wrongdoing, that the state couldn't use its espionage machinery to steal secrets from private companies and give them to Chinese companies. So that's what that deal was about. The aftermath of that, what produced the angst that led to that deal was the Chinese hack on the Office of Personnel Management, which was the huge US government database that holds all of the kind of personal data, identifying data for all government servants, basically, and all of their security clearance information and everything else. So, and it was left completely unsecured. So, I think from the standpoint of a spy agency, that's quite a treasure trove. So it wasn't really that particular incident was in the category that I'm talking about with respect to this principle. I mean, most people would have said, that's a fair game thing for a national security agency to be interested in, and it's not a private sector competitive advantage issue. But there were a lot of other hacks before that were in the category of sort of taking commercial secrets from companies and giving them to Chinese companies so they could compete. And there were a couple of stellar examples of that. One particular in kind of wind power, renewable energy area. So I think the agreement still stands, actually. And right after it was negotiated, there was a major drop off in companies seeing Chinese hackers in their systems. So at the outset, after we negotiated it, it was seen as quite a success. But that was at the end of the Obama administration when we negotiated it. So the record on sort of the time of the success was short. And then the Trump administration came in and basically poo-pooed it. And then you saw all of the kind of hacking go back up again. It's very hard to know exactly what's happening in this space, but you can read, there are American and other foreign cybersecurity companies that do these kinds of investigations and publish things. So it's hard to know exactly what's going on. Of course, the Chinese will say that they're being hacked constantly by the National Security Agency in the US, which is probably true, but it's not the same principle of taking commercial secrets. And I think this commercial secrets deal, it should be revived and promoted as a standard, a global standard. But it's not going to be enough now to solve the problems that we have in technology between the US and China, and in the suspicion that we all have about, maintaining the integrity of our data from other countries. It's just gotten, to be such a big problem and go so far beyond that one narrow issue now that I think it's going to be very hard to tackle.
Thank you. I know we're going to start to bump up against time very soon. And I do know that we have a number of students and young alumni who are on the program today and are curious about your life as a diplomat. And I'm wondering if we can turn the lens to you personally for a few minutes and just ask for you to share your decision to enter the field of foreign service and a little bit about how your experience has been and what advice you might have for people looking to enter the field of foreign service.
Well, thanks, Sarah, for asking about that. I mean, I am such a huge proponent of US diplomacy and of the US Foreign Service and of public service. I've been through some ups and downs in my career, and a lot of times when I'm talking to audiences about a career in public service, people ask about that, like especially now, after serving in so many different administrations, including an administration that had a pretty healthy disdain for diplomacy in general. How did you feel about that? How did you weather that? I mean, I just think it's for someone that's like ADD, like myself, and has a hard time, kind of focusing and bearing down and being disciplined. I mean, the notion that you can move to a new country every few years and go up this really steep learning curve and have a chance to learn about a new culture and a new place and how people in a completely different milieu, how they think and how different it is from the way you think. I mean, it's just endlessly fascinating. And it's probably not for everyone, this notion that you kind of change up what you're doing in a pretty major way every few years might not be for everyone. But I love languages and I love exploring and I love adventure. And so, luckily my family, for the most part, shared those characteristics with me and were willing to go along, which is also another thing that might not be for everyone. But it worked out, so well for me and my family. And I can't say enough good things about my colleagues, how dedicated they are, and how important it is to communicate with people out there in the world. I mean, the world is shrinking and shrinking every day, and we have to know what people in other places are thinking. We can't just be, reflecting everything back to ourselves about how we see things. We have to pay attention. And again, base how we're going forward into the future on realistic assessments that you're only going to get by really being there and seeing what's actually going on.
Thank you. I think that is going to have to be a moment for us to wrap up. We are so appreciative of your time today and your willingness to share your expertise and your knowledge and your enthusiasm for working in the field of diplomacy. On behalf of the Alumni Relations Office and Bowdoin Public Service and the McKean Center, I want to thank you again, Susan. And thank you all for the audience and attending. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Thanks to everyone for coming. See you soon, I hope.
Bye.